Good morning, Victory. Hey, let's welcome Hamilton Mill and Midtown that are watching us live at our 11 o'clock service. We're glad you're joining with us. And all of you that are watching us online. We're in a series. We're calling this series One. This is a big series for us as a church because it's kind of a reflection and a representation of part of our vision, which is bridging the gap between the races. We're talking about how to heal the racial divide. And the purpose behind this particular series is a little bit bigger than just preaching one message on racial reconciliation. This is about starting a dialogue, not only in our church, but outside our church. The beauty of the internet, when we can go with social media, we can start some dialogue outside of our church. And so our hope is for all of you that are watching us, for all of you that are here, that you will start taking some of these things that we put on the internet and sharing them with your friends. And let's start the dialogue going. Let's talk about some of the issues that are out there. Whenever you talk about race and race relations, it's always a little bit challenging because there's the possibility of offense. And so I want you to just kind of prepare yourself not to get offended. And just kind of listen to what I have to say about this subject this morning. Now, we are a church, just so for those of you watching us online, I just need to kind of remind everybody that we are a church of 139 different nationalities. So it's not just one culture here. We purpose to do that. It's a part of the vision of this church was to demonstrate in our community that you can actually do church together, that you can come together. Martin Luther King said back in 1967 that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. And that's a stain on the church. And because of that, we're trying to break some new ground here, trying to create some new dialogue of how do we get people to come together. Now, it's very clear that we're entering into a season in our nation. We've been in this season for a while, but it seems to be getting worse, where races are beginning to divide even more strongly over certain issues in the community. And every time we wake up in the morning, there's something out there on social media, something in the news about tension that is between the different cultures. It could be a Black Lives Matter issue. It could be an immigration issue. It could be whatever those issues are. And unfortunately, much of what's been addressed is one side pitting against the other side and not really reconciling. But when you start to study the Bible, you begin to realize that there's a lot of information in the Bible, a lot of words from God about the importance of reconciling together. And there's two scriptures I'm going to read. One is out of the book of Psalm 133, if you'll turn there with me. And then I'm going to read some words of Jesus in John chapter 17, and then we'll kind of go from there. The first one is Psalm 133 and verse 1. It says, "How good and how pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It's like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It's as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion, for there, wherever people together in unity, there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore." So we see that the Lord likes people being unified around his purposes. And then Jesus makes a statement, and it's a statement about his disciples. He's talking to his disciples about what he wants them to do. And he says in John chapter 17 and verse 11, he says, "I'm coming to you. I will not stay in the world any longer." So he's preparing to leave, and he says, "But they are still in the world, Holy Father. Holy Father, keep them safe by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they will be one." Everybody say one. One, just as you and I are one. All right, so the goal of God was to reconcile people together, to be one together. Now, when you start reading the Bible, you begin to see that there was a lot of tension back in the days of Jesus. He was in a divided culture. There was a lot of animosity between different races, different cultures. He started with the Jewish people, but as he started getting into the gospel, it became apparent that he was not just trying to reach Jewish people, he was trying to reach the Gentile world, which most of us are a part of. But there was this tension that existed in culture, and that tension continued to grow. And I mentioned this a little bit last week about how originally the whole world was one race and one culture. And then through Genesis 11, God divided them according to languages. They started forming cultures, forming nations, of which we now have many nations in the world. Now, down through the history, prejudice has seeded into the hearts of humanity. And because of that, many of us unknowingly carry prejudice in our hearts. And so I thought, let's take a weekend and let's just talk about that and let's get free. Let's just get free. That's why we call this message freedom from any how many would like to get free from prejudice in your hearts? All right. You say, well, I don't have any prejudice. You probably have more than anybody else. You just don't know it. All right, so let me give you the definition of prejudice. Prejudice is preconceived opinion or judgment that's formed against another person that is unfavorable, that's unreasonable, that's unjustified. It's a genuine disregard for another person's rights. It's basically saying that I'm superior to you, or I have some superior way of thinking or some superior way of living. And we all know that there's a history in our nation of prejudice. Now, when you start to get into the theme of prejudice, you begin to see how it forms. It forms several different ways, and the way we would become prejudiced and we have developed prejudice is through these ways. First of all, there's family prejudice. Some of us, when we come to church, we have a heart for God and we do church together, but then we have to go home to our family. And sometimes our family has a different conversation in private than we have in public with people. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You think you get along with people and then you see something that stirs you or gets you upset and you start having these conversations. I grew up in a family that would say they were not prejudiced. They were good people, good country people that lived in the South. But sometimes when we'd have around a table discussion, you would hear them mention another race in a derogatory manner. And I remember hearing that as a young person growing up, and then after hearing the name given to another race, it would form an idea that I would have about that other race. And some of us have grown up like that. Then you have friends prejudice. Friends prejudice is where we have friends outside of this church that we hang out with that have something that's going on in their life where they're prejudiced and their offense gets over on us. They get offended. And now we have social media so we can express our prejudice freely through Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and all these different ways of expressing our prejudice. As soon as we feel it, we want to speak about it. And we influence other people, our friends, on social media. Come on, somebody. Then you have experience prejudice. And this means that you've had an experience where someone has prejudiced against you. They've had some prejudice against you. Have you ever had somebody prejudice against you? I remember one time I was driving down to Florida and I had rented a car because my car was in the shop. And so I rented a car and I decided to rent a convertible because it was in the summertime, and it was a red convertible with a black top, which fit right into my theme of thinking with the University of Georgia Bulldogs. So I'm just listening to some music, cruising down through Dothan, Alabama. And all of a sudden I look in my rearview mirror and I see a police car with his lights on behind me. And I'm thinking, I'm not speeding. But I pull over, and as I pull over, I start thinking, why is he pulling me over? And then two things occurred to me. One is, and this is just something you need to understand, is I'm a white person. I know you don't know that, but I'm a white person. I grew up in a white world. But I have just a little bit of Cherokee Indian in me, and when I get in the sun, in the summertime, I change color. In fact, I get darker than some of you folks that were born dark. And so I was pretty dark, and I'm driving in a red convertible, and I look a little suspicious, and so they pull me over. And so I'm thinking, this is a little stereotype. And so the cop gets out, and of all things, the cop is black. And he comes up to the side of my car, and I'm realizing he's not stereotyping me because of the color of my skin. He's stereotyping me because of the color of my car and the kind of car I'm driving. And I'm just looking a little too cool for Dothan, Alabama. What are you doing down here? And so he says, young man, and I'm not a young man, but he says, young man, he says, what have you got in your glove compartment? Do you mind if I look in there? And I'm thinking, he thinks I'm a drug runner. And I said, no, I don't mind you look in my glove compartment. And so, my glove compartment. A little Slip of the tongue there. Anyway, he opens the glove compartment, and I didn't know this, but my wife had slipped some green vitamin pills inside the glove compartment. Wanted to make sure I took my green pills. So he pulls out the bag with the green pills, and he does this number. What is this? And I said, those are green pills. I said, those are my wife making sure I get my vitamins. And he said, okay. And so then he starts asking me all these questions, and he's profiling me because he's assuming, I'm up to no good. And so as he's talking to me, I'm thinking to myself, here's what I'm thinking to myself. You're prejudiced. You got some prejudice against people driving through your country town, and you're expressing your prejudice. And I said, so what did I do, sir? Why are you pulling me over? I said, was I speeding? He said, no, you weren't speeding. I said, why did you pull me over? He said, well, you came over the top of the hill. You were over in the left lane. There's a 4-lane. He said, you were over in the left lane, and you stayed over there a little too long. And so I'm kind of listening to all this, and I'm realizing what I'm experiencing just a little bit is what a lot of you experience a lot. I don't feel it as much because I live predominantly in a world that I don't experience that. But you understand what I'm talking about. When you get prejudiced against, when you have an experience, and some of you have some tragic experiences of prejudice, against you, it forms something in your heart. It hurts you. Then there's economic prejudice. Economic prejudice is probably one of the biggest prejudice. Poor people, prejudice against rich people. Rich people, prejudice against poor people. We see that play out almost every day. And then you've got middle class, prejudice against both rich people and poor people. You got poor people saying you're controlling society with your money. You don't care about poor people. You're just, you're using me to make money. And then rich people are saying, well, if you just work harder, get an education and get a job instead of being lazy, you wouldn't be so poor. And those are ignorant statements that come out of both sides. Amen. And I know you, whatever level of economics you're in, the tendency is to hang with the same economic level, whether it's rich or poor or middle class. Then there's media prejudice. Media prejudice is almost hourly. You can go on Facebook right now. Some of you are already on there. Just look on there. Just flip through there. You've been flipping. And you will see an event that just unfolded 2 minutes ago that involves prejudice. Maybe you'll see a picture of an illegal immigrant, and it'll say something like, this illegal immigrant raped somebody or murdered somebody out in this particular state, and this is why we need to build the wall. And they'll start going into this whole thing about illegal immigration, and they'll forget the fact that there was about 1,000 other people that did the exact same crime within the same period of time, but they just aren't illegal. Does that make sense? I was watching the Academy Awards this year. Did y'all watch the Academy Awards this year? I was watching the Academy Awards. And I was noticing, last year I watched it too, and last year I was watching it, and there was a big cry out from minorities, particularly Black America, that says, well, there's no blacks being nominated for roles in movies. So there was no black male lead actor, female actor, and so on and so forth. And so this year in the Academy Awards, it was like, you are nominated for everything. We're gonna make up for what we didn't do last year. So we're gonna nominate you for everything. We're gonna make sure that you win. You know that the first black that ever won an Academy Award was in 1939. Her name was Hattie McDaniel. She won it for Gone with the Wind, but the problem is that she won it as a servant slave to Scarlett O'Hara in the movie. And when you see a lot of the roles that blacks play in the media, sometimes the roles are always subservient or criminal. Denzel Washington and Halle Berry both won it in the same year in 2002, which was a big breakthrough for Black America, but he played this corrupt cop, and then you had Halle Berry playing this poor, single black female having an affair with a white racist. Now, that took some acting right there, I'll tell you right now. That's why she won the Academy Award. Every time you turn on the media, there's a TV program that characterizes people in race certain ways that stereotype you. There's things on the media. Every time you turn it around, there's something to stir up prejudice in us. And then you have church prejudice. And church prejudice is the one that I just can't live with. I can't live with that in this church. I can't live with it in church. And this is why we preach about it all the time, because it is still true that 85% of churches in America are predominantly one race only churches. I mean, you've got churches here in Atlanta, which is the multi-ethnic, multicultural capital of the South. Once we had the Olympics in '96, the whole world came here. It's called the black middle class Mecca of America because of the job opportunities and the business opportunities for black America come to Atlanta. When you go on spring break, you don't go to the beach, you go to the city. And Atlanta used to have a big thing, for blacks at spring break. Y'all remember that one? I got a little out of hand. Us white folk did not understand that at all. I'll just tell you that right now. But how do you, now listen to me, because there's some pastors may be watching this at some point. How do you do church with one race only in Atlanta? How do you do that when all around you is multiculturalism? It's one thing if you live in an area where there is no other race, but when you're in the midst of it all, you gotta try, almost be intentional to make that happen. And the tendency is, in church world today, we tend to gear more towards human culture than we do godly culture because we build our churches around our culture. That's why you have the different kinds of churches that they are. They're built around their human culture instead of the kingdom. And so you've got all this prejudice in the church. You've got the white church, which basically says, let's ignore culture. Let's ignore other cultures. Let's act like they don't even exist out there. Then you've got Hispanic church. Let's celebrate our culture, because our culture is fun. You ever been in a Spanish church? You don't come out of there without smiling. It's a joyful occasion. Then you've got the Asian church, which is let's preserve culture. And then you've got the black church, let's politicize culture. You've got all kinds of culture things happening, but they're a lot of times designed to segregate us, to separate us, instead of put us together. So how do we come together? How do we break these prejudices down? Over the years, we've been pastoring here for 27 years. Over the years, I've noticed there's some themes in breaking prejudice that happen in people's lives. And if this hasn't happened in your life, then you can listen and you can learn from this because it'll help you. It'll help you to break free from prejudices. I grew up again in the South with extreme prejudice. I grew up in the Martin Luther King era. Colleen and I got a FaceTime call this week from Bernice King, who is Martin Luther King's daughter, and we were just dialoguing about what it looks like in Atlanta now compared to 50 years ago. Next year will be his 50th year since he was assassinated. And so we're talking about some things to do, and Colleen, I think, is going to go down and do an interview in the King Center this week with Bernice, and just kind of maybe we'll bring that to you next weekend. Because we're going to talk about race and politics next week. Obama versus Trump. We're going to talk about... We're going to get into that. That's going to be fun. You might not be clapping next week. I don't know. We'll see. But anyway, so I asked the Lord this week, I said, tell me how did I start? I still have prejudice I still work on, but how did I start the process of breaking free? And the Lord took me through a little journey of my history. And these are 3 things that the Lord showed me of how to break prejudice off of your heart, how to get free. And if you'll take these seriously, you'll get free. First thing is, you have to go back to the cross. You have to go back to the cross. I think we understand that most of us know about the cross. We've heard about the cross. We sing about the cross. We might even talk about the cross. But very few Christians go back to the cross. Jesus would say it this way. He'd say, if you're going to be like me on the earth, you're going to have to take up your cross. And you're going to have to follow me. But really what I mean by that, by going back to the cross, I'm talking about what was the purpose of the cross. All right, so Paul writes this letter in Ephesians chapter 2. And I'm going to read a few of the verses, and this will give us a better explanation of what it means to go back to the cross. And here's what he says in Ephesians 2, verse 14. He says, "For he," talking about Jesus, "himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier." At that time, the two groups were the Gentiles and the Jews, and they were at odds with one another. There was a barrier between them. Part of that barrier had to do with the law, and part of that barrier just had to do with culture. And he's saying, I came to break down this barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. By setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations, his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, to reconcile them through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. I think it's interesting in this current political environment that one of the main themes of this environment is build a wall. Build a wall. In fact, they said the other day in the news, they said that there was a whole group of Americans on vacation at spring break, college spring break this last couple weeks. So there were spring breakers down in Cancun, Mexico. And they're on one of these boats that takes you out to swim and snorkel and all this, and you're drinking and you're partying. And they got out there, and the Mexicans were on the boat serving them. Serving the drinks, taking care of them and everything. And in the midst of this, they're out there in the water, and they start chanting, "Build that wall, build that wall," to Mexicans in Mexico. This is how crazy this world's gotten. This is how radical we've become about walls. There's 65 current walls in the world that separate people. 65 physical built walls. I was in China back in December, and I saw probably the biggest of all was the Great Wall of China. It was built over centuries of time. Just to keep in mind that when we start to build our wall, it took centuries to build that wall. And what's interesting about that wall is and I understand the purpose of the wall. The wall is to create a barrier to invaders, people who are trying to invade your land that have no good will for your land. They want to harm your land. And the idea behind our wall is the same way as we want to protect our country from terrorism. I understand that. I don't think there's many of us in this room that don't want to protect our country from terrorism. The challenge that we have right now is with all the racial tension and all the problems is in trying to protect our nation. Sometimes we create walls between people that we're not really wanting to protect ourselves from because they're fine, they're good people. So everybody kind of gets lumped into a category because of terrorism. When 9/11 hit, if you were an immigrant and you were here, and maybe you were a young kid or something and you were growing up in America and you hadn't it wasn't that big of a problem with illegal immigration at that point. Now the barriers were more difficult to cross over between us and the southern part of the United States. And so suddenly people got locked in or locked out of the country. And the opportunities became more challenging. Well, what happens is these walls start happening in our hearts. And now we've got an America where we have these different people groups that have walls between each other. Listen to me carefully. Unless they get born again. Now, a lot of people say they're born again or say they believe in Jesus. I wouldn't say they say they're born again, but they say they believe in Jesus. But they carry a lot of prejudice. Here's what I would say to you. If you're truly born again, when I say born again, where Jesus has come in to take over your heart, you view things completely different when it comes to people. So what happens is when you get born again, you go back to the cross, you realize that the whole idea of the cross was to break down the wall that's between you and other people. So now you start entering into the second phase of healing and racial reconciliation and prejudice, and you start to see people through the lens of grace instead of the lens of race. In other words, you're no longer viewing people like Jesus he came and I don't think he saw people based on race. I think he saw people based on grace. That's why Jesus could come upon a person who was a prostitute or a tax collector or just a complete castaway from society and value them as much as he valued anybody else. One person was not more valuable than the other. Now this is what happened to me when I got saved. I was prejudiced. I grew up in the South, I was prejudiced. But now I'm saved, and now I start to look at people of other races, and I start to look at them through a different lens. I look at them through the lens of grace instead of the lens of race. Now let me give you an example, and this is gonna challenge you a little bit because it's a big issue today, and it's something most people kind of shy away from, but I believe the Lord spoke to me about this. What about illegal immigrants? How do we view illegal immigrants in this country? There's two views that people have. One view is through the law of the land. I was having a conversation with somebody recently about this, and they were talking about how police are trained to look through the law of the land and execute that law. And certainly if you're here illegally, there is a law that says that you don't have the right to be here in the land unless you came through legally. So we have these channels to come through legally, and if you don't come through those channels, then if you get caught, you would be sent back. And the idea now under this new administration is we want to send most of you back if you're illegal. Now the reality of that is that that's almost an impossible thing for that to happen, because if we send everybody back, it would probably crash our economy. Because there are many businesses and jobs that run off of illegal immigration. Okay, that's just factual, that's just truth, we all know that. And there are jobs that many of you would not take because they're beneath you. And you can't live off of the wages that we pay those people. All right? Now, in the midst of that, you've got a lot of people that are very good people living in our country that are illegal, trying to figure out how to live in this country, how to stay in this country, and with the threat every day that if they get arrested or they get pulled over in a cop car pulls them over, and they don't have proper documentation, they could be deported, separated from their families. And I think it's easy for some groups of people to say, well, that's just tough, they just need to go back, until you get to know people. Once you get to know people and you start getting into their lives, you find out there's a lot of pretty good people here that if given the right alternative and path, they would probably become legal if we could give them that path. But because of a few bad people, they're affected by that. Are you following me? So then what's the role of the church? The role of the church is different than the role of the government. The role of the government is to enforce the laws of the land. The role of the church is to enforce the law of love. We are not called to enforce the law of the land. We're called to enforce the law of love. Now, what does that mean? That means that whenever people come into the church, our role is to love them whether they're legal or illegal. Did you hear what I just said? To love them into the kingdom. You say, well, what if they're criminals? Even more so. Criminals need to be saved. If they get saved, maybe they won't be criminals anymore. Let me ask you a question. If a prostitute comes into the church, don't you think we should love her? Do you know that there's probably people in our church that used to be prostitutes? They were breaking the law. Can I just tell you something about the law? Almost every one of you probably broke the law this morning. Driving to church. I doubt many of you drove 55 miles per hour, because you know driving 55 miles per hour in the city of Atlanta, you will get killed. Is that not right? 2 years ago, I set an all-time driving record of getting pulled over 10 times. That's almost once a month for breaking the law. And let me just tell you what goes through my mind, and I'm sure it goes through your mind when you get pulled over by the police. One of the things, maybe not the only thing, but one of the things that goes through your mind is, I hope he doesn't give me a ticket. And so I'm just praying, I hope he doesn't give me a ticket. Hope he doesn't give me a ticket. Lord, have grace, have mercy. I probably won't do it again for another 2 minutes. I promise. Roll the window down, yes, sir, no, sir. That's what you say to police. Now, why are you pulling me over? You say, why are you, did I do something wrong? Yes, you were speeding. Yes, sir, I know I was speeding. And you act nice. I set an all-time record, 10 times pulled over, never got a ticket. No, see, you shouldn't applaud that. That's really, that's not a good thing. That's not an applaud thing. But what we want grace when we break the law. I'm just trying to get you to understand something. That's why I think Jesus would say something like this. Before you go judging everybody, before you start judging all these people out there and just making your judgments from your wheelchair or your armchair or your reclining chair or whatever you sit in watching Fox News, whatever you are designing your heart around, before you start making all the judgment calls, maybe you ought to remove the plank out of your own eye before you start trying to remove the splinter out of someone else's eye, because we're all law breakers. So here's what the Bible says in the book of Galatians. I'm going to just read one short verse, chapter 5 and verse 14. Here's what it says. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command. This is the law of church. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now here's what I want you to understand something. Here's how I see people. Once you get born again, once you understand the power of the cross, you don't see people through the law of the world. You see the law of love. What Jesus kept trying to teach the people is break free from this legalistic mindset that everybody's disobeying the law and we need to enforce it over the fact that maybe if we looked a little deeper, there's some reasons why certain people come here that are a little bit bigger than they just trying to break the law. Are you following me? Now, I say that because we could very well see a lot of things happen in the future. We could see a wall go up. We could see a lot of deportation. We could see a lot of things, and I'm trying to get you to see through the lens of what is the role of the church versus the role of government. The role of the church is when you see people, you view them through the lens of grace instead of the lens of race. Because that's what you want somebody to do for you. If you were to go to another nation and there was a high persecution of your people group in that nation, you would want grace more than judgment. You do to others what you want others to do for you because you want to win them to Christ. You want to win them to Jesus. If they do get deported, you've just made them a missionary back to their own country. You've given them some tools to live by, amen? All right, so when I love other races as much as I love myself, then the way I approach the world is different. I approach it differently from the church. I'm not saying it's good to break the law. I'm just saying that we all are lawbreakers. And I need to help you understand right from wrong, but at the same time, I also need you to understand I love you in spite of that. I'm not basing my love on you on whether you obey my laws or not. Are you following me? All right, so when you have this, you start to look through the lens of grace and then race, and then finally, here's how you do it. You start practicing the heart of serving one another. Now, I want you to think through this lens because I want you to think, whatever race you are, when was the last time you served another race? And I mean, I'm not talking about for a job. I'm talking about just loving them, serving them, doing something for them. This is what was staggering about Jesus. When Jesus comes to the earth, he's God. He's not a human just being. He is a God in a human being. He's God in the flesh. He dwells among us. He does miracles. He heals people. He forgives people. He teaches people this law of love. He goes through the earth and he's loving people. And then he tells people, he said, now listen, Before you start to try to exalt me on the earth, understand this. I didn't come to be served. I came to serve. And he would constantly lower himself, even to the point of dying on a cross for people who hated him, for people who despised him, who mocked him, who arrested him, who beat him, who treated him unjustly, who treated him unfairly. He still went to the cross for those people. That's you and I. And he's saying, now look, I'm here on the earth to demonstrate this. And then he says, when I leave, I want you to follow my model. You're an ambassador of me on the earth, which means you're going to have the same persecution that I had. People are gonna make fun of you. They're gonna call you by names. They're gonna persecute you. They're gonna segregate you. They're gonna create prejudices against you. And he says, you've got to learn that your life now has a different meaning. It's no longer reacting like the world does, getting on Facebook and typing all your anger out. It's now learning to love people by serving them even though they don't love you back. And he says, when you start to do this, it starts to break down walls. Then he does something that just flips him out. And I'm gonna do it. He does something that flips him out. And he calls for his disciples to come together and he tells them, he says, now I'm gonna do something that you're not gonna agree with right away, but I'm gonna do it anyways. I'm gonna wash your feet. I'm gonna wash your feet. Now, let me ask you to do something for me in just a moment. I'm gonna wash somebody's feet. Don't record this. We are recording it. We'll put it online, but I don't want you recording it because you might mess it up. Phones going all over the place, and just let it be recorded by the church, okay? Just for the sake of this, because I want this to be a kind of a holy moment right now. But Jesus comes to his disciples and he says to them in John chapter 13, he says, since I, Lord, your teacher, have washed your feet, he just finishes washing their feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. In other words, he's saying, you see what I'm doing for you? I'm lowering myself down to the very bottom of your body, and I'm gonna wash your feet. All right, could you all bring the chair out and the tub out? I'm gonna ask this young man. I need a young black man. Would you come up here on the stage? There's a reason I want a young black man up here, because he represents some things that I'm gonna talk to you about in just a moment. And so, why don't you take a seat right there? And if you wouldn't mind just taking your shoes off and your socks too, thank you. And then I'm gonna wash your feet. Now, let me say something before I wash his feet, because this is important. This young man doesn't just represent Black America. This young man represents all minorities for this moment right here. What most people don't realize about my race is my race has a hard time getting what's wrong in America. We have a challenge. The great slogan that was spoken at the beginning of this presidential race that got a person elected was, we're going to make America great again. Going to make America great again. When I first heard that, and everybody cheered, yay, I looked at the crowd, and it was predominantly my race cheering for that statement. And I thought to myself, okay, if I'm gonna be a Christian, I need to filter that statement through the lens of other races, not just my own. And I'm thinking to myself, here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking to myself, okay, if I'm a black person, maybe a young black man in America, and I'm thinking through the lens, make America great again, I'm thinking, when was America great for you? When was there a season of time in the last 240 something years that America was great for you? And so, I think about it. In the beginning of our nation, 1700s, we brought a lot of people like this young man from Africa by the millions. In fact, history tells us that between 17 and 60 million, no one has the exact number, died in that transition. The greatest atrocity of one race in all of human history. Way bigger than the Holocaust. And we all know about the Holocaust. But for some reason, this has never been really advertised too much, because my race, we don't want to feel guilty. And I'm not saying you should feel guilty, because you didn't do that, but your race did. Then after we had Africans as our slaves, African come to our country and become our slaves, then we also have to live with the fact that we also conquered Native Americans as well. We kind of huddled them over in the Midwest, took over their land. Then we went down to south of America and we said, Mexicans, we're gonna take some of your land from you as well. California, Arizona, New Mexico, used to be Mexico. Who would think a Hispanic person? What was America great for Hispanic people? When was America great for Native Americans? What about Asians? Was it great when Pearl Harbor happened and we took 120,000 Japanese from their homes in California, put them in camps for 4 years because we suspected, even though they were citizens, that they might turn against our country? Was that great? The only people that could honestly say maybe America was great would be me, my race. It was great for us. We had a lot of folks like this young man and other people serving us for the last couple hundred years. And now, over the last few years, some of those people are rising up and they've had enough. And movements are starting and different things are happening in our nation that are saying, hey, we matter too. We are not the majority, but we matter too. And people like us are getting scared. We're getting fearful. Man, this nation is not like it used to be. Are we filtering that through the eyes of Jesus, or are we filtering that through the eyes of our race? And so what Jesus would do in the middle of all this is he would take a person like this, who maybe in general terms wouldn't normally be connected together. A young black man and an old white man. We probably don't have a lot of things in common. The way we grew up, the society we live in. I don't get in my car and worry about a cop pulling me over. I don't worry about being treated unjustly in society like you do. I don't grow up with fear. I don't worry about inequality for my race. I don't have those concerns, but I have them for you. And I care about you. And when I got born again, God did something in my heart towards people like you. And I started thinking, I can't heal this nation. I'm not a healer. Jesus is the healer. The greatness of a nation is never based on a race or the accomplishments of a race. The greatness of a nation is based on whether or not it's submitted to God. We're not great because of our prosperity. We're not great because we won wars. We're great only if God is in our lives and ruling over us. And we've become a nation where God's no longer ruling over us. And that's why we're so angry at each other. And we're fighting with one another, and we're in division over each other. And I can't see our government healing that. I can't see any president healing that. I can't see any leader healing that in society other than Jesus. And that has to start with us in the church. So, Jesus would take one of the disciples and he would wash their feet. He would pour water over their feet because the feet represented the dirtiest part of their body, the lowest part. And he'd say, you don't have to wash the whole body, just wash the feet. It's the hardest part to put your hands on. Who in their right mind would want to wash somebody else's feet? Yet Jesus did that. And he said, you see how I'm doing this? You see how I'm putting my hands on your feet? What I'm saying by that is I'm trying to get you to see something. You're valuable to me. I'm not superior to you. You are just as valuable as I am. I know society hasn't told you that, and I know circumstances in life haven't told you that, and I know history hasn't told you that, but God says that about you. And you deserve the right as a young black man to grow up without fear. You don't need to be growing up with wondering whether or not you're accepted by another society. God accepts you. He's the great equalizer. When he came to the cross, he came to equalize everybody, to take slaves and make them equal to the free, and make the woman and the man equal, and make the poor and the white equal, the poor and the rich equal, and to make everyone equal. And he says, look, I want you to do this because this is what heals the world. This is what causes the world to come together, is when we serve each other, when I can serve you and you can serve me, and we're not living our life trying to have power over each other, but we're family. You're a Christian, I'm a Christian. You're my brother, I'm your brother. We're bros. But there's not enough of me doing this. More of this needs to happen. And so maybe it starts with us in the church. Maybe it starts with the people that are in this church, that we would just say, you know, regardless of our history together, what if we just started loving each other and serving each other and maybe washing each other's feet? What if we had a small group one night and we just all just humbled ourselves, got down here real low and looked up to you and said, you know, I value you. I care what happens to you. I care what you experience in America. I care about the hurts and the wounds of your past. I care about the history of my race against your race. And I'm sorry, I repent. I didn't do it myself personally, but I take responsibility for my own race. Because Jesus didn't do anything to hurt people, but he took responsibility for them. He took responsibility when he went to the cross, and I need to go back to the cross. Because we need healing. We need healing in this relationship. We need to be one together instead of you doing your thing and me doing my thing. And so you're a good representation, not just of Black America, you're a good representation of all people that maybe haven't been treated with value, wherever they're from. And I just want you to know that from this point on, my life is about making sure that you understand that you grow up in an America where there are people that value you from another race. I love you, bro. Hold on. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Let's all stand. Let's stand for just a moment. Let's close our eyes for just a moment. Kind of let that sink in. We need those kind of images in America. We need those kind of thinking images in our minds, Lord, instead of all this stuff that we've been thinking about. We need healing in this nation. We need freedom from prejudice and all the stuff we've grown up with and all the things that we've surrounded ourselves with. And I know, God, your intention in this service is to help it begin in us, in the church. So if it doesn't happen in the church, it's never going to happen in the world. This is the catalyst. This is a starting point for us. It's a starting point for all of us around this nation to just accept that we need healing, not more division. And the only way you get healing is you got to come to the cross, die to your agenda, and accept God's agenda. So Father, would you help us now as a people, our Midtown campus, our Hamilton Mill campus, our Norcross campus, all of you that are watching around the world online, would you help us as a people to start this conversation? To go back into our neighborhoods, our communities, our homes, and just start living this instead of just thinking about it. Start talking about it, but also living it out. I pray that you would anoint the people that are hearing this message and those who have watched it online, God. You'd heal our racial divide, heal our hearts from prejudice, and you give us a new heart for the people that are different from us in this nation. I pray that over us in Jesus' name. And everybody that agreed with that prayer said, amen. Come on, let's give him praise. Lord, we praise you. We honor you.